This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
Yes, it is, Brian. Yes, it is. But it is not just a five-star wrestling podcast. It is the five-star wrestling podcast. What's going on, people? Welcome to the show. Got a good one for you today, especially with our big topic discussion at the end. Before we get into things, though, as always, I need to do my prelim plugs from the jump. If you are watching the show for the first time, or you just happen to stumble across the show here on YouTube, smash the subscribe button for me. Like the video before you head out. And as always, leave a comment down below so I can get your thoughts of any or all of the material discussed on today's program. In addition to finding me here on YouTube, you can also check the show out on Rumble by clicking the link in the description. And speaking of final topic for the show today, that is all going to be solely based around my most recent Chairshot publication, of which you can find all of my articles for that site by heading over to www.chairshot.com, click under the opinion tab, and my work will always be labeled under the name Star. Or you can click the link for my most recent content in the description. Just in case you are new to the show, we host 2 shows every week on YouTube and Rumble, Mondays and Fridays. Monday shows are dedicated to discussing AEW Rampage, NWA Power, weekend pay-per-view events, and in-depth discussions of my personal article content. And Friday shows are dedicated to discussing AEW Dynamite and continuing along in our retro review series, which we just kickstarted this past week, of NWA WCW starting in November of 85, and World Class Championship Wrestling starting in November of 82. And we'll chronologically work our way up through the library from there. Should be a lot of fun. So you're kind of getting a hodgepodge of material here on the podcast, but the goal is to bring as much compelling content as possible. So hopefully you stick around, and greatly appreciate all the support. Anyhow, I don't really have a decent segue into the recap reports this week, so let's just get going with talking about Rampage from November 5th. Kind of a one-segment show when I look back in hindsight, but the one segment we'll talk about surely didn't disappoint. So, our opener is Bryan Danielson versus Anthony Bowens, with the rationale for this match being as follows. The Acclaimed complained that Tony Khan is a terrible manager. And apparently that is all it takes to get yourself a TV match when you've been MIA for a period of time. Shit talk the boss on social media, and you are rewarded by getting to work a match with Bryan Danielson. Seems like an odd punishment. And it would also seem as if a lot of guys would benefit from taking advantage of that. I'm pretty sure I've seen a decent amount of the Acclaimed matches before, but God knows the last time I remember seeing them on television. I remember Caster got into some heat a while back during one of his raps on Simone Biles, but like, if you told me to pinpoint anything significant involving the Acclaimed in the last several months, I'm drawing a blank. I'll say this, though. Bowens has a great look. Kind of seems like he's always been the workhorse of the Acclaimed from what I've seen. And I thought he did fine in there with Danielson. Granted, Bowens sold for a lot of it, and Danielson pretty much carried the bulk of the action, but yeah, nothing looked embarrassingly stupid or choreographed. Danielson ends up tapping Bowens out with the label lock, and that was pretty much it. No Miro sighting here, no afterbirth angle, just Bryan Danielson beats an undercard dude to put him over before his pay-per-view match. Pretty much all it needed to be. So perhaps Tony Khan is watching classic NWA tapes. Nah, I highly doubt it. Had a backstage skit with the Pinnacle and Andrade. Apparently they are running with some kind of story here of MJF loaning FTR to Andrade in exchange for payoffs, which I guess is kind of interesting. Because if I'm not mistaken, didn't they do something similar with this a couple weeks back with FTR dressing up as the Ninja Turtles to steal the AAA tag belts from the Lucha Bros? And obviously this was one that followed up from Wednesday's show where FTR helped Andrade beat Cody. Actually, I think if they run with this a little while longer, they could cleverly use this as a story to launch back into Cody and MJF's feud later next year. Because, what are we going on now? Like a year and a half since their initial pay-per-view match? Yeah, I think it's about time to revisit that. Just saying. So then we had the segment on the show that pretty much everything was essentially built around. The whole ring confrontation with CM Punk and Eddie Kingston. And I'm not trying to mock him or anything, but I'll get this out of the way first, because, people have been raving up a storm about how great this was, and it was good, but, there were a couple things that I could nitpick. And you could tell it took a while for Eddie to get comfortable and settled here with this promo. He was kind of stumbling through his lines initially. Seemed like he lost his train of thought at one point when he was running down the whole apology deal and, why he wasn't on the show Wednesday. But I'll tell you this. Once Eddie started diving into his history with Punk and how Punk spent years shit-talking him in the locker room behind his back and ends up calling him a narcissistic son of a bitch, boy, did Eddie turn this promo around in a hurry. And granted, there was a lot of insider talk here, and personally, I'm not a big fan of that, especially in today's wrestling climate where everyone's so attuned to backstage politics and behind-the-scenes stuff. But they mostly kept it mild here, and essentially boiled it down to Eddie idolized guys like Punk, Danielson, Joe, Homicide, etc. Pretty much the original ROH independent crew. And all the while, those guys spent years talking trash behind Eddie's back, calling him fat, unmotivated, blah, blah. Punk's defense was that the reason that they all talked behind his back was that they were disappointed that Eddie never lived up to his full potential because he kept falling short of the mark. And it ends up boiling to where Punk calls Eddie a bum. Eddie tells Punk that no one in the locker room wants him in AEW and challenges him to a match at Full Gear. And they do some back and forth jabbing. I think Punk threw something in there like, I think Full Gear is too high of a pedestal. I was thinking something more your speed, like Dark Elevation, which admittedly so I laughed at. But, Eddie just ended up getting right in Punk's face, saying, "Fight me," over and over again. And Punk accepted the challenge. And the promo exchange alone probably would have been enough in and of itself. But in a rare AEW moment here, where the brawling sequence was actually warranted, they capped this off perfectly. Because Punk's about to leave, but Eddie tells him that after he beats him at Full Gear, Punk can do everyone a favor by retiring from wrestling for another 7 years and not coming back. And that is when Punk headbutts Eddie and they do the brawl deal with geeks running down to separate the two. And if we didn't see 1,287 of these chaotic mass brawls every fucking week on this show, this probably would have been one of the best in-ring segments of the entire year for AEW. But I'll be damned if this wasn't one of the best pay-per-view sells they've ever done in company history. Off the top of my head, I can't think of one. In fact, this was so great, the only thing I could think when it was over was, how in the fuck is this not the main event of Full Gear now? Like, I'd much rather see this close out the show than Hangman Page and Kenny Omega for the world title. Now, granted, I would be lying if I sat here and told you that I have the timeline knowledge of Eddie Kingston and CM Punk's wrestling and personal friendship ingrained in my brain. I don't. But whether or not the stories were 70% true, 80% true, or 100% true, it really didn't matter to me. Because as a fan, I believed what they were saying. It honestly felt like a genuine and authentic way that two guys with personal beef would handle their issues in real life. They both have modicums of respect for one another, even if they don't openly express it. But they have a score to settle, and they're going to fight it out like men to see who's the better man. And yes, I still maintain the notion that it would probably be in both guys' best interests right now for them to make an extended program out of this. Especially if they want to go all in with Eddie Kingston as a heel, which I presume they eventually do. And you know what? I know this will sound controversial given the way AEW books and the way fans think right now, but if I'm booking this match at the pay-per-view and I'm looking for an excuse to extend the program, I'm going with some kind of double disqualification or no contest finish at the pay-per-view. Let them do some kind of 5-minute knockdown, drag-out street fight. Ref loses control of both guys and just throws the match out entirely. You protect both guys, you plant the seed that the tension is far heavier than initially anticipated, and you build to some big blow-off match the following year, whether it's a cage match or a parking lot brawl or one of those unsanctioned lights out matches. Like, that's the way I'm thinking. That's long-term strategic booking of a program. You have an end date for where you want to build to, and you work backwards to get to that point. Now, of course, you can go with the simple one-and-done payoff, and both guys shake hands afterwards and they go their separate ways. But like, if you're actually trying to make some money and bring in new viewers to the show, here's your long-term main event, semi-main event program that people could get invested in that doesn't involve championship belts. Just two guys with beef and history that can't stand each other and are looking to settle a score. You're telling me that a casual mainstream audience wouldn't get invested in that? Like, the point is, they could make this feud way more than just something for the niche audience. Because I can tell you right now, you go out there and you reach out to viewers that aren't really attuned to what AEW is doing right now. You show them that promo from Rampage here between Punk and Kingston, I guarantee you they will stick around to see where that program goes. So, there's my little spiel on that. All that said, excellent segment. And for those of you sitting there wondering, why didn't they just decide to close this out with the show instead of putting it in Seg 2? Well, my go-to answer is because they're fucking idiots and they don't know how to effectively structure a show, but aside from that, I don't have an answer for you. I guess it was absolutely crucial that we saw John Silver in the main event. Or something. Because I can tell you that nothing else followed that promo segment as far as compelling television goes, and that includes this Red Velvet Bunny tournament match. A match that would have been a bad dark match on Elevation. Here it was not only on national television, but it was a tournament match for a championship belt. And again, though, I'll give them credit, because they've actually been getting a lot better with this recently with their women's matches, especially the girls that are terrible in the ring. They get in, they get their shit in, and they get out before it gets brutally bad. And granted, there was plenty of brutally bad stuff packed into this 3-minute match alone, but I'll spare them here because I'm kind of getting bored regurgitating the same stuff about the women's division in AEW over and over again. Pretty much at this point, you can boil it down to a t-shirt phrase. If it doesn't involve Thunder Rosa, Britt Baker, or Serena Deeb, you can pretty much assume it'll suck. Anyway, our main event of the night was John Silver versus Budge. And I still have no idea what that means. I don't care what it means, especially if it involves being the elite in any capacity. And, well, apparently I wasn't alone in that, because Taz and Ricky Starks shat all over the Budge thing too. And good for them, because heels or not, they're not wrong. I will at least credit John Silver for this. Dude has some sick-looking triceps and biceps. To say that he spends time conditioning his arms in the gym would be an understatement. If only he wasn't 5'2", 175 pounds, I could probably take him seriously. Well, that, and if he wasn't a comedy dork involved with the Dark Order shit. So, oh yeah, and in case you missed my recap from Wednesday's Dynamite program from the Friday podcast, Adam Cole was perfectly fine to wrestle here despite getting his head caved in with a chair by Christian. At least Cole had the wherewithal to somewhat sell it at various points during the match, but I don't know how you sell a concussion per se, but it's AEW. You have to grade it on a curve. And of course, if you're a longtime wrestling fan over the age of, say, 25, you're probably thinking, Adam Cole's selling a head injury going into a pay-per-view. Man, what a tough and valiant babyface he is. To which you'd be correct if Adam Cole was supposed to be a babyface. But when you factor in that he's been a heel on the show since he debuted, well, there goes your ring psychology. Once again, Taz being the best part of this match by getting furious when Silver kept kicking out of all the false finishes, of which there were many here, and I honestly could not tell you why they decided to do all the WrestleMania false finishes in this match, especially in a match involving fucking John Silver, of all people, but they did. There was some shenanigan garbage with the Beta Bucks on the outside, sent the Dark Order clowns out to, well, not brawl with them, but merely engage in conversation. And like I said, Cole and Silver spent like the last 3 minutes doing back and forth, no-sell offense and false finishes, and finally Cole put him away with the boom. And I think they made the announcement prior to this match that they are indeed going with the 6-man at the pay-per-view with the Elite versus the Jurassic Express and Christian Cage, with the added stipulation of it being Falls Count Anywhere. As I predicted. And yes, for those keeping track at home, that is 2 multi-man gimmick matches that'll entirely be built around spots and oh shit moments. Can't just get one of those on the show. Nope. We need 2. So, not really digging that. At least Cole's on the pay-per-view in some manner. Yes, more than likely doing more bullshit spots with the Bucks, which is probably the last thing Cole needs to be doing right now, but I think long gone are the days of Adam Cole being taken seriously as a pro wrestler anymore. Careful who you endorse, people. One minute they can be the highlight of the wrestling shows you watch, and the next minute they're blithering idiots doing lame comedy and completely destroying all credibility. Way to go, Matt and Nick. Hope you're happy dragging Cole back down to your guys' indie-orific level. That said, I definitely recommend you guys go check out that CM Punk Eddie Kingston promo if you didn't already. That alone is worth the watch. The rest of the stuff on the show, I really could take or leave it if I'm being honest. Danielson and Bowens was fine as an enhancement match, but really wasn't anything more than that. women's match sucked. No shocker there. And the main event was one of those matches that primarily appeals to the AEW niche audience and the Elite Club fan base. For me, it was a match, and not even really a good one at that. At least, not for the wrestling that I enjoy. As noted, though, it is amazing how big a difference a 1 hour show suffices over a 2 hour show. And it's why I'm always on edge about the possibility of them considering going 2 hours with Rampage, because if it ever ends up happening in the future, I really fear it'll hinder my overall enjoyment of the show. In the short term, I don't think I'll have anything to worry about there, but God, with the amount of talent they've got under contract now and the dumbass AEW crowd constantly pushing for 2 hours of Rampage because they have nothing else going on in their lives, it's only a matter of time before Tony caves. That's what he does. Listen to the audience. Because the audience is always right. Right? So remember last week when I spent like 10 minutes rambling about all the confusion with the NWA By Any Means Necessary show? Well, they aired the show this week. Or at least part one of the show. And to say that I much preferred this show over what they aired last week with that whole Mickie James Vanity Project, all women's episode of Power, yeah, we'll leave it at that. Now that said, I will air out some overall frustration at the beginning here before we get going, because I've complained about this before with NWA Power, and for whatever reason they insist on further subjecting me to this torture. Whoever's idea it is to continually allow Austin Idol to do commentary, I'm aiming one finger at you right now, and you can venture as a guess as to which finger that is. It's one thing to have a heel commentator that jabs back and forth with the babyface commentators at various points in the program. Like, AEW does this with Taz and Ricky Starks, but those guys at least have a filter and know the proper times to be wacky heels. Austin Idol was just intolerable on this show from start to finish. Between the bantering with Velvet Sky, his constant interrupting of Galley trying to call the action, like, it's just go away heat with me at this point. And I guess the idea is we're supposed to want to see someone kick his ass and shut him up for good, but unless this all leads to Velvet Sky sucker punching him at the desk and knocking him the fuck out, I don't need to hear Idol call matches on NWA programming ever again. He's not witty, he's not entertaining, he's not adding anything of value to the show. All he does is drag it down. So please, stop with the Austin Idol commentary. Like, as much as I complain about the three-man booth, it's just a thing that exists in pro wrestling anymore. I have no idea why this is so necessary, but apparently every promotion is obligated to have more than two people at the commentary desk. If you have to do it, put Tim Storm out there. Storm is so much better at color commentary than Austin Idol is. Like, and Velvet's not even a particularly great color commentator herself, but like, she's at least improving and trying to call the action. Like, Idol's just totally going into business for himself at this point. So we begin the show with Jax Dane hyping up his cage match with Crimson, which, going back to what I was mentioning at the beginning, but got sidetracked with the whole Austin Idol thing. It looks like the stuff they aired this week from the BAMN card was all prelim stuff. So I presume that next week's show is going to be the show where they do all the featured matches. Promo here from Dane was solid enough, though. You know, and they've done a relatively decent job hyping up his feud and going over the backstory with Dane and Crimson. My presumption is that Dane will end up going over, because I know they've been teasing him and Trevor for the world title for a while now. Traditionally, cage matches in pro wrestling are usually designed for the babyface to go over in the end, but I mean, it's 2021. We've pretty much thrown the rule book out the window at this point anyway, so who cares? So then we cut to the ring for this Pope promo, which was indeed pimpin', as one might say. And is doing some dialogue for a bit. And that eventually leads to the Colby Carino Pope match that I was initially confused with when it came out in the card spoilers. Like I said, I'd presume everything they were doing in the lead up to this show was all designed to set up Pope and Trevor for the world title, but I guess that match is happening at the Hard Times pay-per-view in early December. That said, the match was perfectly fine. I still can't get over how closely Colby resembles a 2010 version of Austin Aries, but when you look past that, he's a very solid worker. And I don't even think he's been in the wrestling business that long either, which makes it all that more impressive. They did a deal at the beginning where Colby came out with his new team of the Fixers, which consists of Jay Bradley and Wrecking Ball Legursky. And they factored into this segment in more ways than one, but I'll get to that in a minute. But Pope and Colby are going back and forth for a while. Pope ends up making a comeback at the end. The bodyguards take the ref, and one ends up dropping Pope on the opposite end for a near fall. And eventually this leads to the Ill-Begotten running out to get involved. I did kind of scoff at the Ill-Begotten doing an unexpected run-in, yet they end up throwing up a graphic of their names on the screen. That was kind of a minute production gaffe that really shouldn't have been overlooked. But Pope ends up cradling Colby to get the win. And I would say if you can discount the unbearable train wreck of Velvet and Austin Idol bickering on commentary, it was a very fun opener. But speaking of the Ill-Begotten and the Fixers, they end up having an impromptu tag match after the break, which really just ended up turning into Legursky and Bradley smashing these two goons in a couple minutes. But they get on the stick afterwards, and they do a brief intro to who they are and what their agenda in the NWA is, that whole deal. And that's all well and good. But the surprises didn't end there, because after the Fixers, for lack of better terms, fix the Ill-Begotten, out come Mike Bennett and Matt Taven of ROH fame for yet another impromptu tag match. And obviously I'm very familiar with Taven and Bennett's history, although the more and more I have flashbacks of everything I've seen involving Mike Bennett in the past 5 or 6 years, the more I try to forget most of it ever happened. But this ended up turning into a pretty good tag match, all things considered. A lot of it was pretty standard stuff with the faces running wild early on. Heels ended up cutting Taven off and working him over for a while. Faces ended up doing a big comeback at the end. Yes, there were a couple dive spots with Taven, but they kept it in moderation here by essentially making them the only dives in the segment. Bennett got a nice hot tag at one point. I will say it did get a little chaotic at the end there for me, you know, especially when all 4 guys were in there doing stuff and the ref was mostly just standing around letting it happen. I mean, if I'm going to call out AEW for doing this kind of shit, I'm not going to shy away from calling out NWA for it either. But Bennett ends up dropping Wrecking Ball with a spear, and Taven goes up top for the frog splash and gets the pin. Yeah, the crowd went crazy for the finish, by the way. In fact, if you didn't know any better, you'd probably figured you were watching an episode of World Class from back in the day. So, I mean, all in all, it was a hell of a TV segment. I guess if I was looking for a pretext to nitpick it, I could say, well, isn't it kind of stupid to debut 2 monster meatheads in a tag team and then turn around and beat them in the exact same segment by another debuting tag team? And yeah, in retrospect, it is kind of silly booking. I guess the thing we'll have to wait and see on is whether or not either or both of these teams end up sticking around in the future. Obviously, most people are familiar with the whole Ring of Honor situation at this point, so more than likely, I see Taven and Bennett sticking around as regulars for the show. Like I said, I probably wouldn't have beaten the Fixers this quickly if they are going to be sticking around for more tapings. Just seemed too rapid fire to me. So after that whole fun, crazy start to the show, we get Sauronaro versus Judais, which was far less crazy and fun, to put it bluntly. The whole thing was just an extended enhancement match to put Judais over, although I don't really see how much that really did for him, considering Judais has already done a clean job to James Storm on TV. And I think I've recently noted this briefly, but Judais just really doesn't have a whole lot going for him. And for me, it's one of those situations where if you remove James Mitchell from the equation, Judais would absolutely flounder. Just a very generic looking big guy with an average physique and blank facials. I guess they added a stip in this match where if Sal didn't win, he wouldn't receive a national heavyweight title shot for 18 months or something. And if I had any real emotional attachment to Sal, I probably would have felt bad that he got beaten here, but I don't know. This segment didn't really do a whole lot for me. Up next was this tag match with the Hex defending their women's tag belts against Tootie Lynn and Thunder Kitty. And according to Joe Galley, Kylie Ray was supposed to be in this match, but apparently made a post on social media in the last few days saying she was taking some personal time off. And I feel like I've heard that exact statement from Kylie before when she was signed to AEW and Impact Wrestling. The translation was, I'm retiring, but not really. She's basically like the female Leo Rush at this point. Like, latch onto a wrestling company for a bit, retire for 3.5 months, and then randomly return only to retire in another 3.5 months. You think Billy Corgan would have been cognizant of Kylie's history and figure maybe she's not the most reliable person to have under contract, but what do I know? Regardless of whether or not Kylie would have been part of this match, I can't really say she would have added much to it. It was passable as a match, I guess. Kind of just seemed like another enhancement match to put over the Hex, which I guess is fine. I guess my question coming out of it, and again, I'm not even trying to be a dick about this, but it is a genuine question. Why does the NWA need women's tag titles? Like, WWE does the same thing with their women's divisions. I think they have women's tag belts for both the main roster and NXT. And while I can't really say I care about women's tag wrestling one way or another, I could at least justify WWE's rationale for having women's tag belts in the sense that they've already got a lot of women on the roster anyway. You could at least feasibly construct a roster of 3 or 4 teams to build stories and programs around. But in the NWA, like, what other teams are there beside the Hex and Terrence group that aren't makeshift duos? Is the talent pool really deep enough to warrant having a women's tag division in the NWA? Like, even AEW doesn't have women's tag belts, and they've got way more women under contract than the NWA does. I don't know, it just seems unnecessary to me. Now, I could see a scenario where you might be able to make something out of a women's tag division if you brought in pairings like the Beautiful People or the Iconics to do a program. And granted, I don't think the matches would be blowaway or anything, but, at least you have 2 established teams that could go up against the Hex that you could build programs around. Like I said, I'm not really advocating for it because I've seen plenty of Beautiful People Iconics matches before, and let's just say I'm good, dog. And our main event for the show, Scion versus Mims. And again, they are still running with the story here of Scion and Tyrus feuding over the TV title. Now, why they didn't just do that match in the main event, I couldn't tell you, but I'll be damned if this match here between Scion and Mims wasn't a hell of a TV main event. Granted, I set the bar pretty low in terms of expectations, mostly because of stuff I've seen from both of these guys on the show really hasn't left me in awe, but they had a relatively enjoyable main event match. Easily the best thing I've seen either guy do on the show since I started watching again back in August or September, whenever it was. A lot of it was back and forth with both guys looking to gain leverage and control over the other. Some really stiff-looking 1-2 exchanges, which looked pretty good. A couple false finishes at the end. Mims tried for a brainbuster, but Scion reversed it, plants him with a swinging neck breaker, eventually locks in the crossface, and Mims struggles in the hold for a minute, goes to reach out for the ropes, but Scion ends up stopping his free hand, and Mims ends up passing out. Like I said, very entertaining main event. The only thing that didn't make sense to me in the whole thing was the fact that Scion's going to be going up against Tyrus for the TV title, and Tyrus is clearly the established heel in that program. But for a good chunk of the match here, Mims was the one playing babyface in peril while Scion was working him over. And granted, like the crowd wasn't really booing Scion, so it's hard to even classify that he was getting the heat here, but Mims was the one pretty much working from underneath for a good portion of the match. And at the very end, when Mims passed out in the crossface, the only thing I could think was, man, they ended up doing a lot more here to put Mims over than they did Scion. So, just very strange psychology with the way they laid it out. But, of course, Scion gets in Idol's face after the match, and Idol pretty much tells him he's got until the December pay-per-view before Tyrus takes him out for good. And that was the first part of the By Any Means Necessary show. Like I said, very weird deal with the tape delay schedule, considering they filmed the show, what was it, like back in mid to late October? Yet we're finally getting the show aired now a couple weeks after the fact, and they're already teasing the hype for the next pay-per-view. Overall, though, I thought the show was enjoyable, at least with what I guess we'd categorize as the prelim material. The OGK debut was cool. The main event was a lot of fun. They managed to actually pack a lot of action into this hour without anything becoming, too rushed. Definitely looking forward to the featured content, which I assume they will air next week. Other than the Austin Idol commentary, I really don't have anything to complain about here. Watch the show on mute or do your best to filter out the commentary. All right. As we wind things down in the show, I did want to use the final segment of the Monday show here to talk about the most recent Chairshot publication I had. And this has been a topic of conversation I've been meaning to write about for a while, but honestly, I was just looking for the proper time and place to do it. And I think the catalyst for my inspiration to get going on this article really stems from all of the fallout to the whole drama over the Charlotte-Becky Lynch title swap segment from SmackDown a couple weeks back. And, to tell you the truth, I probably could have written the entire article solely based on the stupidity of that segment alone, but, when I look back at the beginning of the year with where WWE was with the women's division and, I compare it to where we are now, it's a conversation that goes beyond just a dumb title switch. Especially when you look at who their top female champions were just as early as the spring of this year in comparison to where we are in the fall less than 8 months after the fact. And in order to understand where we are with WWE and women's wrestling as a whole in 2021, you really have to go back to 2015 and look at that sort of transitory shift period where the company started to reassess the scope of women's wrestling as a whole. And this is taken directly from my article here. Quote, 2015 was an extraordinarily pivotal point for WWE with regards to their perception of women's wrestling. During this year, the company began to reevaluate their approach to the featuring of their female talent and capitalized on the increasing popularity of 4 particular women that became the center of attention, not just in NXT, but professional wrestling period. Charlotte Flair, Sasha Banks, Becky Lynch, and Bayley. And obviously, I have fond memories of this period, mainly because this was well into the period where I was consistently following the NXT product over the main roster product, as I think a lot of people were during this time. And B, there was a valid case to be made that during this particular time, Charlotte, Sasha, Becky, and Bayley were the more compelling characters and had the more compelling stories and matches on the show at this point. And keep in mind, this is also during a period where you still had guys like Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn and Finn Balor at the top of the brand. Samoa Joe, I think you throw in that mix too. And, as I expand on this 2015 time frame, the Fortune 4 of the women's division, as I end up referring to them as here, were not the only talking head of the women's wrestling in WWE at that point. Y'all remember that silly hashtag Give Divas a Chance trend because WWE had booked a women's match on Raw or something that got less than a minute of TV time before it got completely dismissed. And I don't mean silly in a facetious manner, but the whole idea behind fans even needing to start a Twitter trend for the WWE to give their women more than 5 minutes of screen time just sounds totally ridiculous on the surface, especially during 2015, because Raw was 3 hours. Why even have a women's division at that point? But, you also have to remember WWE's old school approach to the way they traditionally featured the women on their show, and then understand the cultural shift we were at this point with male and female dynamics, and, more or less are still in that today to an even more extreme level. But especially in pop culture, 2015 is where sort of this male-female tension really started to pick up in waves, especially in the mainstream. But, fast forward mid-year with Charlotte, Sasha, and Becky being featured parts of the main roster TV, Bayley soon being added into that mix by 2016. By the conclusion of WrestleMania 32, the often scrutinized Butterfly Divas belt was trashed entirely in replacement of the Women's Championship. All of the old order tropes of associating the term diva with the women talent was pretty much thrown into the memory hole at that point. They started valuing the female talent as equals to the men, at least on the surface blank slate level of equalism from a PR level. But the point is, Becky, Charlotte, Bayley, and Sasha were at the helm of that periodic shift. So moving along in my article here, quote, since 2015-2016, they have been WWE's Fortune 4 of the women's division. They have been the reliable go-to talents that the company has dependently fallen back on to carry and market the key storylines. Contextually speaking, they have been the female equivalent to the post-Lesnar Ruthless Aggression era male Fortune 4, John Cena, Randy Orton, Batista, and Triple H. And there lies the problem, unquote. So now comes my sort of thesis, if you will. Quote here. When you factor in the period of time Cena, Orton, Batista, and Triple H were on top in WWE in some sort of rotational position, you are essentially looking at somewhere between a 7 to 10 year period. It was an absolutely disastrous post-RA period for WWE, and they are still feeling the effects from it years later with the talent that had passed through the system at that point that never reached their full potential after being shackled from breaking the glass ceiling of the Cenas, Ortons, and Hunters of the world. Unquote. And by the way, when I use the acronym post-RA, I'm referring to the ruthless aggression era, primarily that 2005 to 2008, 2009 period once Cena and Batista sort of became the established focal points of the company. And of course, if you followed WWE for years and you're well attuned to that long period where WWE essentially rotated the top spots around Cena, Orton, Batista, and Hunter, you're probably well aware of just how bad that period was for WWE. Take a look at how business did during that time, how drastically and incrementally they drove fans off. And I mentioned here in the article that Like when you would see brief glimpses of them momentarily pushing guys like CM Punk or Jeff Hardy into the top picture, it's like the common phrase goes, everything in that company, one way or another, ultimately revolved back around the same Fortune 4 guys in some way, shape, or form. And like in the cases where the Jeff Hardys and the CM Punks of the world would start to gain any form of initial traction, you saw how quickly all the Fortune 4 would thwart that momentum, right? And if you really need me to rally off the Cena burial list during his tenure as a top guy in that 10-year stretch, I'd have enough guys on that list to assemble my own independent federation. Hunter, same deal. Orton, probably a little less substantial, but I mean, he's had his fair share of holding guys down. How do you think they went about building up the world title program with him and Kofi Kingston a couple years back? Anyway, moving through that to bring the women back into the conversation, quote, the comparison of the Fortune 4 of the women's division with the men's Fortune 4 is to demonstrate the point that WWE is approaching early stages of oversaturation with Charlotte, Becky, Sasha, and Bayley in the year 2021, unquote. Now the question is, well, how did we get to this point? Well, let's draw some analogies and pull examples just from this year alone. Quote, just this past April, WWE began to allude to the idea of elevating a new generation of female main roster talent with the pushes of Rhea Ripley and Bianca Belair. Rhea and Bianca won the SmackDown and Raw Women's Championships at WrestleMania, respectively, by cementing the two clean victories over a previous era of women's talent. At the time, if you had proposed the idea that by the fall of this year, the Raw and SmackDown Women's Championships would be back around the waists of Becky Lynch and Charlotte Flair, it would have sounded unreasonable. Lo and behold, Becky and Charlotte are, once again, the top champions of their respective brands. Unquote. And as I state in the next sentence, they've also got Sasha added into that title mix right now on SmackDown. Oh, and as for Rhea and Bianca, the two up-and-coming female talents that had vital key WrestleMania moments just 6 or 7 months ago, well, Rhea's been thrust back into the mid-card scene on Raw and not really doing jack shit at the moment as far as I can recollect. And Bianca just did a clean job to Becky on Raw in the last 2 weeks. All the while, as has been the uncreative tradition with Survivor Series in the last 6 or 7 years of doing brand versus brand where nothing is ever at stake except for bragging rights, they're more than likely building to Charlotte and Becky again in a champion versus champion match. Because after seeing countless Charlotte-Becky Lynch singles and multi-person matches in the last 6 years, what's one more match? I mean, Christ, we only saw John Cena versus Randy Orton something like 87 times in a 6-year stretch? Perhaps Becky and Charlotte are going for that glorious lucky 88. And although I'm clearly being frivolous, you can see the comparative problems here, right? The insinuation seems to be that WWE doesn't value their future generation of female talent over the feminine Fortune 4. The Rhea Ripleys, the Bianca Belairs, the Shayna Baszlers, the Toni Storms, the Tegan Noxes. What are their roles right now? Collecting dust? Just flailing around in mid-card obscurity while the same top women that were around in 2015 or 2016 are still at the center of attention in 2021 going into 2022? How is that building a new generation of talent? How does giving Bianca and Rhea a short run as the top champions only to have them drop both the straps to two of the Fortune 4 doing them any favors? Especially when there really doesn't seem to be any clear-cut direction for any of them after the fact. And yes, people are going to throw this out there because this just occurred recently. I have heard about the Shotzi Blackheart heel turn on SmackDown. And for my money, unless it leads to her smashing through Sasha and, cementing her as the top heel on SmackDown, I really don't see what good it does her. What they need on SmackDown is the top babyface challenger to go after Charlotte, which at the moment doesn't really seem like they have one right now. I think they can make a lot of money with Toni Storm and Charlotte as a title program. Even Shayna Baszler and Charlotte as a program. Now, granted, in a Shayna Charlotte case, one of them would probably have to flip babyface, and God knows Charlotte's past any point of being looked at as a babyface in that company. But I look at the scope of how things have shifted with the women's division in the last several years. They've accumulated a lot more female talent under their belt. They've called up a lot of women from developmental in the past few years. They have plenty of good to very good potential talent to build as the top faces of their designated brands. And yet, here we are in 2021, and who are the featured faces of the women's division right now? Charlotte Flair, Becky Lynch, with Sasha Banks just sort of hanging in the wings. You think it's about time they reevaluate their current women's scene? Because here's my main point to the conclusion of my writing. Quote, discounting personal biases and preferences, Charlotte, Sasha, Becky, and Bayley absolutely serve a purpose in the company, but they cannot be the focal point of the women's division forever. At some point, WWE will soon have to understand the same reality that they eventually realized with Cena, Orton, Batista, and Triple H. The fact being that they will soon phase out of the top scene and will need suitable replacements to fulfill those roles. Unquote. And yes, obviously the implication here is not that Sasha, Becky, Bayley, and Charlotte are old and broken down. Christ, I think Charlotte's the oldest of the bunch at a mere age 35. It's not like she's on her last legs or anything. Now, granted, we probably shouldn't dismiss the fact that women typically have shorter tenures in the wrestling business than the men do, mainly because their bodies are just not physically built to bear that amount of punishment for a long period of time. But as long as you have the Fortune 4 women under contract, you should ideally be doing everything in your power to help establish these new talents that you're calling up from NXT, especially the ones that are real commodities. Because otherwise, what's the point? If you're going to bring them up from developmental and you're not going to do anything with them, just leave them in developmental. Doesn't that seem like common sense? Yes, obviously WWE is probably never going to get a lot of mileage out of someone like an Aaliyah or a Liv Morgan as like a top champion or anything. But you're really telling me you couldn't make some real money with Bianca Belair, Rhea Ripley, or a Toni Storm over a 5 to 6 year stretch? Get the fuck out of here with that shit. This is coming from someone who's very critical of a lot of women's wrestling on the market today. If you're going to try and sit there and tell me that there isn't major money to be made out of a monster babyface Rhea Ripley beating a heel Becky Lynch at a WrestleMania for a title, you're just a fucking idiot. But the time to capitalize on this is now. Because those fresh faces you have on the main roster right now, WWE, they're not going to be around forever. Nor are the fans going to be invested in them forever. We all know how this works. Once you start giving the impression that you don't want to go all in with particular talents, the fans are going to start souring on them. And when you factor in a lot of the women that they have in NXT right now, yeah. No offense to Tampon Girl and Janie's Got a Gun or whatever her name is, that whole Toxic Attraction faction, but when that's being sold as the future of the women's division, probably not in the best company shape. I'll just leave it at that. Anyhow, that article is available at the Chairshot if you guys want to read it and check it out. Or you can click the link in the description and take a gander. It'd be great to hear your feedback of where you currently stand with main roster WWE and their women's division. Maybe I'm in the minority. Wouldn't be the first time, but I know what oversaturation feels like in WWE. And if the 10-year span of watching Hunter and Orton and Cena play hot potato in the main event taught me anything, it's when you spend too long waiting to build up new guys, you get saddled with the same old guard. And it never gets any more tolerable. Guys, if you want to stay posted with future FSWR content, make sure you subscribe, comment, and rate the video for me. Again, also available on Rumble if you guys want to check the show out there. Stay posted for Friday's episode where we talk about AEW Dynamite, which, if I'm not mistaken, is their go-home edition before the pay-per-view. And we'll also take a look at the next NWA, WCW, and World Class episode from the archives as we explore the Retro series. Until then, take care all. Peace.